Well, good morning, everybody. I know there's a few people still getting lunch, but I'm going to go ahead and launch in because I'll explain in a moment. What I'm doing here is going to take me a bit of the whole hour, actually, and hopefully leave some time for questions at the end. What I decided to do for this one of our first works in progress this year is actually to do an encore presentation of a talk that I give once a year at the AMIA spring meeting. It's called the Translational Summits or the Informatics Summits. The field of clinical research informatics is one that I'm honored to have helped define. And so years ago, after I was the first chairperson of the first instance of this meeting about a decade ago, I was asked by the next scientific program director if I would do a year in review of the field, which at the time was an easier task than it is today because there was less stuff happening. But I've been doing it ever since, and this was my 8th presentation, and it's the talk that I spend the most amount of time preparing for. I have to literally review to some degree or another hundreds of articles and then sort of pull them down and then present them in the course of about an hour. And I get to do it once. So I thought, you know what, I'm gonna do it again. And most of you weren't there. So that's also a benefit. You'll hopefully learn something from this. So with that, I'm gonna go ahead and launch in. And you can see I just didn't change anything. It still says the date that I presented it earlier this year and everything, but I'll walk through it. It's also the case that it's been, is somebody drowning or does anybody else hear that? I don't know what that is. Somebody on the phone, if you could mute your line because we can hear bubbles. I don't know what I'm listening to. Somebody on the line, if you could mute your line, I'd appreciate it. Or we're just gonna be entertained by flowing water. Okay, I'll just speak around it. Maybe if somebody else can mute them on our end, that would be great. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and launch in here. As is always the case with these talks, there's a number of disclosures, and I do my disclosures typically when I'm doing this, and I'll do that here for you as well. We're providing CME credit for this. The approach to this presentation. So what I do here is a mixed approach to article identification. I start with a structured approach akin to, if anybody's familiar with the old ACP updates, where sort of go through literature, come up with a search phrase, and then go through and what I do then is, depending on what I retrieve from PubMed, I then augment that with whatever seems interesting. I track things throughout the year, and I learned a lot from the last 7 years of doing it. So in this particular case, I had an initial search with these mesh terms, biomedical research and informatics, and I had the date range of January 2017 to February 1st of 2018. So it's a little more than a year and a month. I limited my search to English and to those with abstracts. So I ended up with 395 articles from that. Then I had recommendations from colleagues that I solicit. And I also did searches with keyword terms like those you see there. And that yielded 435 total articles, from which I determined that 276 were relevant to the field of clinical research informatics. And then I selected from those 53 representative papers that I will present, most of them very briefly, and some of them with a little bit of depth. What this is not is a systematic review. It's not an exhaustive review. There's a lot of literature out there. It's my best attempt at covering for the last year what I thought was most interesting. It's a snapshot and what I thought was notable. And I always apologize to everybody. So we have 53 articles. This is actually the most I've ever reviewed. As I've been doing this over the years, it's ranged from about 35 to now 53. And these are the categories. I broke down the articles that I reviewed into these categories: data sharing and data reuse, recruitment and eligibility, learning health systems and delivery science, patient-reported outcomes, social behavioral determinants of health, and patient perspectives, and then ethics, policy, and perspectives. And in each category, I shout out a few, and I talk about a few in depth, and then I conclude with some notable events of the last year that were impactful to the field. And then I always apologize up front because invariably I missed some people's work. And when I give this talk in the spring, oftentimes those people are in the audience that I'm insulting by not talking about their work. And I'm sorry. So, all right. So data sharing and reuse for research is the first category. And again, it's been a while since I've seen these, so forgive me if I hesitate a little bit as I walk you through these. But the first article is evidence for benefit of statins to modify cognitive decline and risk in Alzheimer's disease. This was an interesting study, not only because of its potential impact to how we think about the use of statins in Alzheimer's disease, but also because fundamentally the methodology for this involved a meta-analysis of multiple clinical trials. And it was a good example, I thought, of the kinds of things we're seeing more and more of that can only be done through data sharing. We wouldn't be able to get this. So in this particular case, for this audience, many of you know this all too well, that statins have been posited to have a role in Alzheimer's disease treatment, and that we investigate, and there have been multiple investigations into this, that the authors had access to a unique database of raw clinical research data. That's important. They actually had the raw clinical research data from 18 studies of Alzheimer's disease through the Alzheimer's Disease Cooperative Study and the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative, conducted between 93 and 2012. They had this integrated data set with demographics, cognitive assessments, ApoE genotyping, concomitant medications information, and then blood tests for a total of over 4,500 participants and 25,000 encounters. And so with all that, they were able to essentially synthesize a meta-trial. And the results of that took it from multiple different studies that didn't quite reach significance or had failure to an interesting finding where, as you can see from the blue and the pink graphs, the thing to take home is that whether it's global cognitive score on the left-hand column or mini mental status exam results, the changes were rather impressive when you grouped these different results together, suggesting that there is some impact of statins, and it was more pronounced when you looked at the group that had ApoE positivity. So the conclusions were that their conclusions were that the use of statins may benefit all Alzheimer's disease patients with potentially greater therapeutic efficacy in those that are homozygous for ApoE4. The clinical research informatics conclusion is that combining clinical trial data enables this kind of study and findings that were heretofore elusive, and it's further evidence for needing to sort through our issues around data sharing, because otherwise we can't make discoveries like this. All right, the next paper is the stakeholders' views on data sharing in multi-center studies. This was an attempt to look at a lot of the issues from multiple different stakeholder perspectives as to what it is that they think about data sharing. And so they looked through semi-structured interviews with 5 U.S. stakeholder groups. They interviewed patients, researchers, IRB and regulatory staff, and multi-center research governance experts, as well as healthcare systems leaders. Not big numbers, but they were trying to start to get their arms around this and publish this in the Journal of Comparative Effectiveness Research. And they wanted to look at perceived benefits and value and cost and security concerns. And the conclusions were that the stakeholders were open to data sharing in multi-center studies that offered value and minimized security risk. That's not earth-shattering, but it was a good paper to sort of demonstrate how you did this. And then they proceeded to put those major themes into some kind of a framework that seemed to indicate through the arrows the way these different factors have relationships to each other. So when we're talking about discussing the issues of overcoming concerns around data sharing, this is not a technical problem per se. This is really one that's socio-organizational and political. And so understanding these risks, I thought, was important, an important paper contributing to our understanding of what those are, what the perceptions are. Another paper then was data authorship as an incentive to data sharing. So again, in the same theme of what does it take to get people to want to share data? For those who don't know, there's been a lot of controversy in the field. There was even a New England Journal of Medicine article by the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine a couple of years ago that started to characterize people who take other folks' clinical trial data and reuse it as data parasites, and this sort of negative connotation to the reuse of data without the involvement of the original data curators and collectors. And there's some understanding of why it is people feel that way, but on the other hand, we have this great need to make sure we're really using these data for good. And so this was a paper trying to speak to, all right, if we're gonna overcome that, part of the concern is that the people who originally come up with the data sets put a lot of sweat equity into pulling these things together and a lot of resources. often then don't get credit if somebody else uses it. So is there a way to give data authorship credit to people, or in some other way recognize their contribution? And so they talked about in this particular article a framework for doing that, where depending on the level of involvement one has, one could be cited either as an actual author or as a data author, as a new type of author, if you will, or both, depending on the contribution and their analysis. So is this concept of data authorship as an additional element that currently journals don't consider and really wouldn't allow. And they talked about a lot of the reasons why this would be important and how it could be done. And this was a description of the different ways in which one could basically earn credit. It's a way of overcoming that. Also in this area of data sharing is another paper that I highlighted on data quality assessment guidelines for electronic health record use. This is by Nicole Weisskopf and colleagues that was published in eGEMS. And what they did was try to come up with a formulation based on a triangulation of 3 different methods to look at they basically conducted this development effort to come up with a 3x3 data quality assessment table that was evidence-based. So they did a triangulation from 3 different studies. They reviewed the literature. They did a quantitative study of EHR data completeness and a set of interviews with clinical researchers. And then they reviewed all of this by a panel of EHR data quality experts. And the result was a construct that I'll show you an image of in a moment that provides guidelines embracing the task-dependent nature of data quality and data quality assessment. So one angle here, one level of the framework is completeness, correctness, and currency of the data, and another set of dimensions is the patients, the variables, and the time. And then each of those 9 resulting squares, operationalized constructs, maps to a methodological recommendation in their paper. So it's a way to think through these kinds of issues of data quality for reuse. And here's one of the key figures from that paper showing, again, completeness, correctness, and currency, and then the different elements. And you can see within those, where might you be talking about something? So if you look at the currency of variables, the question is then, are variables recorded in the desired order, as an example? Other notable papers in this category then, data sharing from clinical trials, a research funder's perspective. This was an interesting paper because it actually, again, was speaking to this notion that came out of the New England Journal that, hey, maybe we shouldn't be sharing data. And this was from the Wellcome Trust, the Medical Research Council, Cancer Research UK, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, all getting together to say, actually, this is really important. We need to be sharing clinical data. This needs to happen, clinical trial data. Then there was this paper on a conceptual framework of evaluating data suitability for observational studies that, again, was looking at this concept of the suitability of data for those particular kinds of studies. And they contributed a comprehensive framework for assessing the suitability of data for observational studies, even beyond data quality issues. Some other papers I highlighted, the association between androgen deprivation therapy and the risk of dementia, not so much because of the particular finding with regard to dementia, but really the sort of meta finding, which was this was, again, an example of an observational cohort study using 11 million largely unstructured clinical notes and reports to find an association between the use of androgen deprivation therapy and the risk of dementia in a cohort of over 9,000 men. And what they found was an increased absolute risk of dementia in those on androgen deprivation therapy that was 4.4% at 5 years. The kind of thing, again, you can only do with very large data sets. An observational cohort study and the challenges of in silico experiments in JAMA Oncology, a commentary related to the earlier article on androgen deprivation that was relevant in highlighting some of the key challenges to secondary use, and then a nice article on data sharing in cardiology in the Journal of the American College of Cardiology. And then I ended, because this happened to be my first trip after my surgery, so I ended with one that was related to pheochromocytoma that, again, described in this particular case for a very rare disease how you can only do the kind of research on rare diseases that you sometimes need to do by pooling data. So this was a retrospective review performed on what's called the nationwide inpatient sample that some of you may be familiar with, that comes out of the health as part of the Healthcare Cost Utilization Project, or HCUP. And with those data, patients were identified with pheochromocytoma as having high rates of preoperative comorbidities and postoperative cardiopulmonary complications and longer and more costly stays than people with other types of endocrine tumors or other adrenal tumors. And again, rare disease research that can only be done that way. And my conclusion was that I'm now a mild-mannered scientist again. All right, next category, CRI methods and approaches. The first paper in that category, a longitudinal analysis of data quality in a large pediatric data research network. This was a report from one of the PCORI clinical data research networks called PedsNet that has been conducting this work for quite some time, more than a couple of years now. This was over an initial 18-month startup phase across 8 hospitals. And what they wanted to do in this case was identify data quality issues that they were experiencing and then characterize those better. There's some understanding that issues around data quality exist in the form of systematic errors and random errors, but they wanted to get more empirical about this and really analyze what sorts of errors they were finding and how they were overcoming them. And so this was a report on that, looking at those data quality issues. And so, again, typically we focus on 2 major causes of data issues: systematic errors caused by programming errors when you're doing, for instance, ETL processes where you're extracting, transforming, and loading data, and then random errors, inaccurate data transcription or typing errors. And this work resulted in more granular causes. They had 10 precise causes that they enumerated from this work, motivated by real-world scenarios, and they further evaluated those and created an effective heat map of using 3 scientific studies that they actually facilitated through PedsNet to look at what were the data quality issues. And you can see, the only thing to focus on with regard to the heat map is that it wasn't the same. The data quality issues that they had weren't the same across the 3 different studies, but there were these different categories, and they were able to identify across those, either higher quality or if they were lighter shade or white are data elements that were not relevant to that study, but they were able to look at those. And so over time, what they found was a trend of decreasing or fixable issues, not surprising. Over time, as they got more experience doing ETL, they had fewer of those kinds of issues, but they had a steadily increasing number of data quality checks and increasing awareness of inherent data issues even as they were fixing a lot of those. And so with the evolution of the network, they had less of a focus on the ETL concerns and more on the norms of clinical pediatrics and research readiness. Basically, the problems were more over time about how it is we're collecting the data in the first place and whether or not those data we collect are suitable for research use versus the things you first focus on when you're doing this work, which is, are we extracting it correctly? Are we doing the transforms correctly, et cetera? So a nice description of real world evidence looking at data quality. Then there was another article on REDCap, the pragmatic method for transforming clinical research data from the REDCap solution. And I imagine most people are familiar with that as an electronic data capture tool that most places use now, originally out of Vanderbilt. And transforming that to the CDISC standard, the Clinical Data Interchange Standards Consortium standard, which is the from which the Study Data Tabulation Model, or SDTM, is what's used to report to FDA and to other agencies on results of clinical trials that have relevance for approval of drugs. And so if we could have a way of transforming data from REDCap very easily into a CDISC SDTM standard, it should facilitate the work of getting data collected and then moving it along, rather than what happens today, which is almost every study sort of has its own way of, its own parallel way of either extracting that information and retyping it into that standard table, or in some other way adding to work. And so they developed a clinical trial to evaluate the tool that they called REDCap 2 SDTM. And long story short, they were able to leverage that system and a dynamic approach to generate the SDTM XML without programming. And rather than having one off for each clinical study, they were able to show that, in theory anyway, this could be replicable. And they had a nice diagram demonstrating that. Another article I highlighted was the MIMIC code repository. So for those who aren't familiar, that's the Medical Information Mart for Intensive Care. Very robust code repository And this speaks to the issue of lack of reproducibility in medical research studies as a major issue, because they basically took and described how they could use the mimic code repository, which is this centralized code base for generating reproducible studies on an openly available critical care data set, and leverage it. The code is provided to load the data into a relational structure and then create extractions of the data and produce entire analysis plans, including research studies. And this was a nice description of how something like that could facilitate research. So they talk about the mimic code repository enabling this kind of reproducibility by having a code repository with concepts that are extracted from severity of illness scores, comorbidity status, administrative definitions of sepsis, and others. Again, the repository's issue tracker also is helpful in terms of understanding data and concepts and enabling collaboration. And so the point of this particular article was that the centralized repository provided a platform for users to be able to, of the data, to be able to interact directly with the data generators and facilitate greater understanding of the data. It's not unusual when you come into contact with data that's been deposited by somebody else, you may not fully understand the context of those data or the provenance or what have you. And so this was an example of how a code repository like this could be helpful. And they were talking about it in a particular area of critical care research. So by providing an open source code alongside the freely accessible database, they augmented what was in Mimic as data with code that should enable reproducibility of EHR-derived studies. The next was a study looking at physicians' perceptions of alternative displays of clinical research evidence for clinical decision support with clinical vignettes. And so their objective was to design different ways of presenting and displaying information on summaries of trial results to clinicians that are trying to make decisions. It's often the case that clinicians, when we're faced with our patients and complex issues, have to turn to the literature, and the way that the information gets presented and how difficult it is to cognitively process can be a big factor in whether or not you can actually apply it in that evidence to practice. And so they were looking at different ways of presenting that information and actually studying that. And so this was a 6 between, so information displayed, presentation order with 3 within, and I'll show you what that means, factorial design. 2 alternative display design on information foraging theory, the idea of narrative summaries that reduce the content to a few sentences, going from PubMed citations that you would have to read entirely to narrative summaries to a tabular presentation as sort of the 3 different approaches, the tabular presentation being organized in the so-called PICO format of population, intervention, comparison, and outcome, which evidence-based analysis is used to trafficking in. And so the designs were then, again, compared with the original PubMed summary display format. And this is just a information foraging theory cartoon for the super nerds in the audience. So the physician perception were again checked on these 3. So you have the top left there, which is the PubMed reference. You have a summary, a summarized text, and then you have this tabular format. And as you can see from the diagram down here, the summarized text in the tabular format far outperformed PubMed, and in most cases, the summarized, or rather the tabular format was better. And that's essentially what they described. And so this informs designs and approaches to translating evidence into practice and trying to overcome that big gap between when evidence becomes published and when it can actually be acted upon by clinicians. And it's just a study looking at the issue of human factors in displays. Some other notable papers in this category, evidence appraisal, scoping review, conceptual framework, and research agenda. This was a nice literature review to address key parts of the issue of reproducibility and generalizability. This is a big problem in the medical research domain, and so this was a nice article, I thought. The next was dynamic ETL. This was a hybrid approach for health data extraction, transformation, and loading, where they basically took multiple disparate sources from, let's say, electronic health record systems and showed how they could develop a dynamic ETL approach that could take all of those and map them to a common prevailing model, the OMOP model in this particular case. Then you had the identifying collaborative care teams through the electronic medical record utilization project. This was a study in mining EHR utilization to explore patterns and useful methods. I think are relevant from that for a lot of the things we do in research. Predicting inpatient clinical order patterns with probabilistic topic models versus conventional order sets. This was an automated approach to detecting thematic trends in patient care and generating clinical decision support content. And I think there are research use cases that could result from this one, which is why I highlighted it. Clinical code set engineering for reusing EHR data for research. This was a review of software tools that enable users to create, revise, extend, and review shared code sets, and then had recommendations for their design and implementation. And then the last one there was comparison of EHR-based diagnosis documentation locations to a gold standard for risk stratification in patients with multiple chronic conditions. And so this one started to speak to, you know, as is often the case in the record, where is the definitive diagnosis? Where is that contained? How do you get it? And how do you use that when you're coming up with risk stratification? And so they talked about some insights and some lessons for leveraging and reusing data across different risk models, given the variability of where those diagnosis data are sometimes stored. The next big category is participant recruitment and eligibility. The first study there, I'm sorry for that item on the top right, but it was a survey of practices for use of electronic health records to support research. So this was a study I was actually involved in where a large group of the CTSA consortium surveyed the member organizations of the CTSA, about 62 different organizations, to really get a handle on how it is that they're using electronic health records to support research recruitment. And it was a really remarkable response of 98% from the CTSA consortium to this survey that came from the informatics group and the methods group of the consortium. The findings were that brokered access to data warehouses and self-service query were the two most widely implemented and used approaches to this. You know, much like the services of our data core, for instance, and a platform like I2B2, for instance, and that the demand for EHR data is high for this purpose. That when use of EHR data for recruitment is limited, it's often the result of logistical constraints and limitations on collaboration. A minority of the students had EHR patient portals that they were actually leveraging for research purposes, so actually pushing opportunities through the patient portal to potential participants. Only 20% had that. Electronic alert targeting to clinicians was in the sort of middle range. And related to workflow and regulatory processes, a variety of issues were sort of illustrated there too. So here's one of the graphics. And what I'll draw your attention to is that the sort of darker, more darkly shaded areas are where there was either initial or full implementation and operation. And you can see on the left there, the brokered data warehouse and self-service query were by far the highest in terms of implementation and operation. And then you had EHR registries, patient portals quite low, and other provider alerts, research assistant alerts, and BI tool access being somewhere in the middle. Similar findings here with regard to perceived demand of those particular elements. And so wide variation in the implementation and approach across organizations at the moment, kind of a snapshot of where we are as a community in terms of adopting and using these tools, but some useful insights into the current use. And it informs some of the work of the last line is the CTSA's Recruitment Innovation Center, which is a group that's actually working on innovations in participant recruitment. We happen to be a part of that here. I'm the site PI for this collaborative. The next article is I Concur, which is an informed consent clinical data and biosample use for research. This was an interesting article in that what they were talking about was a web-based approach to consent for essentially the allowance of reuse of data and biospecimens. But what they did in this case was they tried to use a tiered approach where they would ask the participants not just yes or no, but yes for what kind of use, for what type of end user. So are you okay with this being used just at our local institution for research? How about if we work with an outside nonprofit? How about if we work with a for-profit? And giving people some fine-grained ability to control what they consent to and just exploring what impact that has, which is very interesting. And so here is a graphic sort of trying to demonstrate that, where you can't really read this, but on the far left, it was like no sharing was under 10% for the majority of these, and most people were into sharing. They also, interestingly, in this particular case, I thought that was fascinating. I guess it was because of who they had access to, but they did this across two major units. One was an internal medicine clinic with general internal medicine patients, and another was an HIV/AIDS clinic specifically. And you might have assumed that the HIV/AIDS population would be a little more leery, but it turns out that actually that red bar up at the top in terms of willingness to share was actually the HIV/AIDS population, whereas the general internal medicine population was lower down, and then all is represented by the blue in the middle. So a tiered electronic informed consent system, first of all, they demonstrate was feasible. This idea of tiered consent where you could have variability was one of the things they wanted to test. These are very early findings. It's a relatively small group, but it indicates increased satisfaction. They had some early indications of increased satisfaction in the users of being able to be somewhat fine-grained in terms of what they gave permission to. It didn't seem to significantly affect participation in a negative way, which is another important finding. And it was a small sample, and further study is needed, but it adds to this literature. They then had the next article was an article of experience with direct-to-patient recruitment for enrollment in a clinical trial of a rare disease. This is from the Vasculitis Clinical Research Consortium. So vasculitides are rather rare conditions. This is, in fact, a subgroup of the Rare Disease Clinical Research Network that is funded by the NIH. And it's often the case that for rare diseases that you have to do multi-center studies. You can't do that at one place because of the nature of rare diseases. And so they wanted to test whether a web-based direct recruitment approach was worse, better, or the same as a center of excellence-based model where the investigators are the ones doing the recruitment. And so they did this patient-centered recruitment and web-based informed consent process for randomized clinical trial, in this case of patients with granulomatosis with polyangiitis, which is the new name for what was previously called Wegener's granulomatosis. We don't have to get into why it's not called that anymore. Results of this particular study were that the patient-centered approach through the website was not as successful as the Center of Excellence approach. That enrollment of those confirmed eligible for their physicians was 77% versus 96% in the direct patient versus Center of Excellence arms, respectively. That was statistically significantly different. And that the two approaches were not significantly different in terms of who was eligible or potentially could have enrolled. And there seemed to be no difference in the understanding of the trial as reflected in the knowledge surveys. So that was important. Another important piece to this, did people even understand what they were saying yes or no to? It seemed to be similar because they actually did surveys to understand that. Here's sort of the flow diagram of how each of those went that show, again, they enrolled about 10 subjects on the left-hand side, 49 on the right. They started with a different number, but I told you the percentages. So their conclusions were that the direct-to-patient recruitment was substantially less successful than the Center of Excellence approach, but it was good at confirming eligibility, and that the direct-to-patient approach should be evaluated in other settings. My conclusion is that's not so bad. You had some direct-to-patient enrollment that actually led to some people enrolling. It seems that they understood it about as well as it would have happened if you had gone a much more resource-intensive approach of having a person try to do that. And this isn't really an either-or option in the real world. You could use both of these approaches and in that way augment your recruitment overall. So I agree that more studies needed, but I thought it was a promising study in some ways, and I was a bit more optimistic than they were. Some other ones that I highlighted in this category, one is called ELI. This is an open source information extraction system for clinical trial eligibility criteria. Very interesting approach of being able to extract eligibility criteria from electronic health record databases and then be able to make matches more easily. That's out of Colombia. You have leveraging the EHR4CR platform. This is a European platform that's used across multiple different European medical centers to support patient inclusion in academic studies. And they had an article here about challenges and lessons learned. I've reported on some of their progress over previous years, so this was an update. Text mining and electronic health record. This was an information extraction approach for automated identification and subphenotyping of the PEF patients for clinical trials. This was a good study, again, talking about this idea of text mining of the EHR to identify and subphenotype. And then the last was a search algorithm for identifying likely users and non-users of marijuana from free text of electronic health records, which I thought was interesting because we were in California, so I just decided to talk about it. It's legal there. I don't know if you guys know that. All right. Other notable papers in this category, a population-based approach for implementing change from opt-out and opt-in research permissions, and in PLOS1, a very interesting article. The next one, a randomized controlled trial evaluating the utility of a patient decision aid to improve clinical trial-related decision-making. The next one was predicting recruitment feasibility for acute spinal cord injury clinical trials in Canada using a national patient registry. I thought that was very interesting. Just again, how people are reusing these different entities and to identify people for studies. And then understanding the role of message frames on African-American willingness to participate in hypothetical diabetes prevention study. This is another article in a growing compendium of articles looking at underrepresented groups in clinical research studies and how we can go about improving the participation of representative samples of the population in our studies, where often it's the case that for a variety of reasons we have underrepresented minorities underrepresented in clinical research studies, and that of course impacts the degree to which the results are as applicable to the whole population. The next category was a relatively new one, or an expanded one for this last year, which was patient-reported outcomes, social behavioral determinants of health, and patient perspectives. I kind of lumped all those together. So let me tell you a few of those that I highlighted here. And you can tell I'm going quickly here because there's a lot to get through. So I hope I'm not speaking too fast. Overall, survival results of a trial assessing patient-reported outcomes for symptom monitoring during routine cancer treatment. This was, again, an assessment of survival associated with EHR-reported system monitoring. This was a letter in JAMA. It's a fascinating letter, a fascinating article. So what they did here was they took data from September 2007 to January 2011 at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, and they took information about those with patients on routine chemotherapy for metastatic solid tumors at Memorial Sloan Kettering that were invited to a randomized clinical trial. The participants were randomly assigned either to usual care or to the patient-reported outcome group, in which patients provided self-report of 12 common conditions from the National Cancer Institute's common terminology criteria for adverse events. At and between the visits, via a web-based PRO question platform, they fill these out, and then participation continued until cessation of cancer treatment, voluntary withdrawal, or transition to hospice or death. PRO, patient-reported outcomes of severe or worsening symptoms, resulted in an email alert to the clinical nurse, and then a report for each patient's symptom burden based on the PROs was generated at the clinical visit for the treating oncologist whenever they came back, and the usual care group just got usual care. The results are remarkable. So of the 766 patients randomized, the median age was, you can see 61, and it gives you some demographics there. Basically, the baseline variables were well balanced between the groups at the point. The overall survival was assessed in June of 2016 after 517 of the 766 participants, 67% had died, as expected with metastatic solid tumors, sadly. And at the time, at which time the median follow-up was 7 years. The key is this: the median overall survival was 31.2 months in the patient-reported outcome group and 26 months in the usual care group, a difference of 5 months that reached statistical significance. And in the multivariable model, the results remained statistically significant with hazard ratios of 0.83. Here is the graph demonstrating the divide there. So the integration of PROs into routine care of patients with metastatic cancer was associated with increased survival compared to usual care. So the question is why? One potential mechanism of action is early responsiveness to patient symptoms that could have had an impact, certainly. And nurses responded to system alerts 77% of the time. They sort of walk through that. Another potential mechanism is that patients in the intervention group were able to tolerate continuation of chemotherapy longer than usual, perhaps because, again, their symptoms were being handled. The conclusion then they had was that electronic patient-reported outcome monitoring may be considered for implementation as a part of a high-quality cancer care. My conclusion was, wow, like you have the implementation of patient-reported outcomes leads to an extra 5 months of survival. If that was a drug, we would charge a lot of money for that. That is pretty amazing stuff. Now, this has to be replicated. You know, more studies should be done on this, but it certainly suggests something that needs to be followed on. So pretty amazing. Okay, next article, detecting atrial fibrillation using a smartwatch. The mRhythm study, and importantly, as I'll tell you, this is from a vendor, and there's some conflicts of interest here, but nevertheless, interesting stuff, and I think it's worth highlighting because this is sort of a sign of the times. So atrial fibrillation, obviously a very common condition, and better ways to detect silent AFib certainly would be very important. And so what they wanted to do was determine if a deep learning algorithm could detect atrial fibrillation using the heart rate data measured by PPG on an Apple Watch, basically, the technology that tracks your heart rate. So they had people without a ventricularly paced rhythm undergo cardioversion. Atrial fibrillation patients without a ventricular paced rhythm, regular rhythm, were underwent cardioversion. They were enrolled. Participants were then fitted with an Apple Watch for 20 minutes pre and post cardioversion, and then continuous heart rate monitoring in a workout mode. And they did a standard EKG. Just some example of shots there of the app and the watch, and the fact that they were collaborating with folks at UCSF to do this study. And what they found was that their algorithm was in fact able to discern this abnormal rhythm. So they had successful cardioversion in 41 patients. They had some description of who those folks were. And again, they were able to determine to a higher degree of accuracy than was previously validated that they could detect this. So their conclusion, and I think it's fair, that an Apple Watch could accurately distinguish pulse recordings from atrial fibrillation from those obtained through normal sinus, rhythm. And detecting atrial fibrillation using a commonly available now and continuously worn device may represent a novel approach to passively and automatically detecting AFib. My conclusion, these are very preliminary findings. There were conflicts here that I imagine were managed, but nevertheless, it puts a little bit of an asterisk on this. And these are early results, but still, it rings true. And I think given where we are with our devices and what's sort of becoming ubiquitous, it's something that adds to our understanding and we need to further follow up on. The next article was, what do these scores mean? Presenting patient-reported outcome data to patients and clinicians to improve interpretability. So here, this was published in Cancer. The idea was, how do you help people understand what the patient-reported outcomes mean when you're presenting them to clinicians and the like. And this was a bit of a complex one, so I won't go through this in great detail in the interest of time, but essentially what they showed here was that these example presentations, they had one presentation that showed normal score ranges shaded in green, and in this case you had the line going up meant worst fatigue. So if it went down, that was better fatigue. A bit confusing. In the second one, you had red circles that showed possibly concerning results. Again, down was better. And then you had a red line for the third one, which in this case, line going up means worse fatigue again, but you had this red line. And ultimately what they showed was that the higher equals better interpreted ones were more accurate than the higher equals more interpreted ones. I don't know that the finding of that particular piece is as important. You can go back and read the full article if you're interested. I think the more important thing is that we need more studies like these to understand how best to present patient-reported outcomes. And this is just one early one to sort of move us in this direction. We don't really know how to do this well. And so this was an attempt at doing it, which is why I highlighted it. I'm not sure I would have designed it exactly the way they did. The next article is a framework to guide the collection and use of patient-reported outcome measures in learning health systems. And as you all know, we have a major effort here to implement learning health systems. So I thought this was very relevant. It's happening across the world, really, and certainly across the US. So as the value of patient-reported outcome measures in patient care expands, a framework to learn how to leverage these is important. And so this was a nice article really describing in some significant detail from a group of experts how it is that you should think about the use of patient-reported outcome measures. They had some shared value of patient-reported outcome measures across user groups. So, what would the patients and clinicians think of this? For how is that valuable? Well, individual patient care decisions are part of why it's important for that group. Whereas for hospital leaders and clinicians, quality improvement considerations. Whereas for insurers and hospital leaders, value-based payment considerations. And for researchers, policymakers, and funders, perhaps population health and research considerations. So it was a nice implementation framework that was very thoughtfully put together and that I wanted to draw attention to about how you should think about the use of patient-reported outcomes when you're creating a learning system to take into account the needs of the various stakeholders involved. And so I thought it was a useful framework to consider. Again, they had some very nice figures in there about how you would think about this in terms of informing practice, how, what, where, when, etc. Some other notable papers in this particular category of really growing literature in this area are the following: using social media to monitor mental health discussions, evidence from Twitter, user guide to integrating patient-reported outcomes in electronic health records, using structured and unstructured data to identify patients' needs for services that address the social determinants of health. You might recognize that author, Josh Best. Integrating social determinants of health into primary care, clinical and informational workflow during care transitions, and then an initial evaluation of the impact of Pokemon Go on physical activity.
Yeah,
which I thought is interesting in that I think we're going to start to see more of that sort of thing moving forward. Okay, then there was a category specifically on learning health system and delivery science. One of the articles there was about this, again, framework. This is from our colleagues up in Michigan, Chuck Friedman and colleagues. This one was in the Yearbook of Medical Informatics, where he really talked about learning health systems and the informatics implications there. Again, in the interest of time, I won't belabor this, but it's really a great overview of learning health systems and informatics implications and putting it in context. Had some really good descriptions here of the different elements of core values across, again, different players in the environment, and then the typical and now widely recognized sort of virtuous cycle of taking data to knowledge, knowledge to performance, and then performance back to data, and creating a learning community around a health problem of interest, and then having learning cycles that take into account people, technology, processes, and policy to be able to create and enable learning health systems. Another article was in Health Services Research, the development of learning health system research core competencies. This was I thought, an important article. Actually, on the heels of this, AHRQ also put forth an RFA for a K-12 training program to train people to actually become scientists in learning health systems, and the announcement of the places that are likely to be the dozen or so funded training programs in the country should be forthcoming relatively soon. This is an article about the basic elements of core competencies that an expert group felt would be important for somebody who was training in that discipline. And so you'll see listed here some things that are very akin to what we all do. So core competency domains include system science, research questions and standards of scientific evidence and research methods, informatics, ethics of research and implementation in health systems, improvement and implementation science, and then engagement, leadership, and research management. They had a total of 33 core competencies prioritized across the groups. Other notable papers in this section: analytical methods for a learning health system, delivery system science, lessons learned when introducing pharmacogenomic panel testing into clinical practice. That's certainly something that is growing, including here. Patient-centered network of learning health systems, developing a resource for clinical translational research. The Delivery Science Rapid Analysis Program. This is a research and operational partnership at Kaiser Permanente, Northern California. And then bedside back to bench, building bridges between basic and clinical genomic research. The last category is what I call CRI, ethics, policy, and perspectives. And this is going to be a pretty quick one. How am I doing? Oh, I'm still doing okay. So the first is ethics, big data, and computing in epidemiology and public health. I thought a very nice article on the issues that are emerging around that space. The next one by Ken Goodman and colleagues, health information technology as a universal donor to bioethics education. The idea that bioethics education really is sort of absent health IT and informatics education at this point. And so somebody from the intersection of ethics and informatics talking about the importance of making sure that ethicists better understand. Crossing the health IT chasm, considerations and policy recommendations to overcome current challenges and enable value-based care. This was led by Julia Alder-Milstein, formerly of Michigan, now at UCSF, and I was a co-author on this one. Pragmatic Trial Informatics, a perspective from the NIH Healthcare Systems Research Collaboratory, a nice article talking about 4 broad categories of informatics-related challenges to pragmatic clinical trials using clinical data, integrating data from heterogeneous systems, using EHRs to support interventional delivery and health system change, and then assessing and improving data capture to define study populations and outcomes, and some challenges that impact the validity, the reliability, the integration, the integrity rather of pragmatic clinical trials, and I thought was a nicely written piece. There was also an article last year on the emerging role of the Chief Research Information Officer and how that's taking shape. There was also in terms of notable events, I'll now move on to those. Several of those. One notable event was, for those who don't track it, the CTSA consortium. Again, 62 universities were one of them, that have numerous different groups associated with them, including informatics cores. This was the development of a CD2H, which is what clinical data to health consortium, to say, how do we take this informatics approaches across all these 62 different entities and better coordinate them, essentially a coordinating entity for the informatics activities of the CTSA consortium. That was established. There was the National Library of Medicine came out in March of this year with their strategic plan, a platform for biomedical discovery and data-powered health. So a 10-year plan for the National Library of Medicine, very relevant to a lot of the work that we do. And then the NIH also had a draft of the data science strategic plan simultaneously. They weren't exactly aligned at first, and they're becoming aligned now. And I think very promising that there is so much interest in this area that we're seeing data science and the kinds of activities that are happening in that space really getting into the strategic plans for the NIH and the subsections of the NIH. Also very notable, the 21st Century Cures Act implementation. There was really bipartisan congressional support for research funding, especially at the NIH, and that's been ongoing and has been essential, and seems to be getting a bit better. But there was bipartisan agreement about the 21st Century Cures Act that was on firm ground, but the implementation of it has been delayed, and it looks like it's moving forward. It's very important that it move forward because there's things in there about FDA guidance, about the All of Us program, and about other elements that are very relevant. With regard to HIES, and obviously very relevant to our colleagues at the Indiana Health Information Exchange and a lot of the work that we do with them, there's a big move in this Office of the National Coordinator, what's called TEFCA, the Trusted Exchange Framework and Common Agreement. This is an ambitious set of policies meant to enable even more prevalent and ubiquitous sharing of clinical data. And research is among the permitted uses that was envisioned in this rule, and it comports with the common rule in HIPAA. It's somewhat controversial. ONC received a very high number of comments about this, and it's been finalized, and now it's sort of moving forward. But actually, I don't know that it's been totally finalized yet. I think it's still being finalized. And then we had this article on health information exchange use that was a review from 1990 to 2015, a systematic review. And of course, the work here in Indiana was highlighted significantly there. We also had delays on the common rule enactment, which is very important to research because it really updates a very antiquated rule in terms of a lot of the things that we need to do around IRBs, around research enablement. And I won't walk through all these different components here. I'm happy to share the slides, but there was quite a bit of activity the last year on that. We have also the All of Us program, the 1 million patient enrollment for genetics and genomic analysis program, and the Cancer Moonshot. Both of those things were also launched. And within that, Sync for Science and Sync for Genes were parts of that. We had the installation of the newest Office of the National Coordinator Director, Don Rucker. So I highlighted that. And then the development and opening of a new journal, JAMIA Open, which is a new informatics journal focused on sort of open science. So this was an open platform journal that was launched last year as well. So in summary, there's a lot of activity happening in this space of clinical research informatics. It continues to accelerate, much more activity than in past years. It continues to mature and is driving science now. Initially, a lot of it was about development, a lot of it was about building tools, and now it's about how do we drive science, how do we accelerate science, how do we actually make this move faster? And there's studies now starting to show us the potential there. Despite the challenges, and multiple federal and state initiatives continue to advance the field. And I think we're moving closer and closer to realizing the vision of a learning health system. So I think it's an exciting time. I have a number of colleagues who sent me article ideas, and I highlighted them here to thank them. And then I post these slides and all that on my website, so you can go there as well. So with that, I will stop. Thank you. I know that was a lot. It's always a lot, but any questions? All right. Well, thank you guys for listening. I overwhelmed you, I'm sorry, but thank you for listening. I appreciate it. Have a great day.